The Viridian was a world of polished mahogany and hushed reverence, a place where money whispered and power dined. For Ilara, it was just a job. A grueling 10-hour-a-day performance where she donned a starched apron and a smile that rarely reached her tired hazel eyes. She moved between the tables with a practiced grace, her feet aching in their sensible black shoes, the scent of truffle oil and expensive wine clinging to her hair. She was good at her job. She was invisible, efficient, a ghost who refilled water glasses and cleared away the remnants of $1,000 meals. That's how she liked it. Invisibility was safety. He always sat at table 12 in the secluded alcove by the bay window that overlooked the rain-slicked Chicago street. He came alone, always on a Tuesday, always at 8. His name, according to the reservation book, was Mr. Alessandro Moretti. To the staff, he was simply Table 12. He was a man carved from shadow and stillness, his dark hair impeccably styled, his suits tailored with a precision that bespoke immense wealth. He never made small talk. He never flirted. He ordered the same thing every time. Risotto al tartufo and a glass of Barolo. He would eat slowly, deliberately, his gaze often fixed on the city lights beyond the glass. Most of the staff were terrified of him. There was an aura around him, a palpable weight that silenced chatter and straightened spines. But Ilara wasn't afraid. She was too tired for fear. To her, he was just part of the Tuesday routine, the quiet anchor in her chaotic week. Tonight, however, was different. The long sleeve of her uniform had ridden up as she reached to place his wine glass on the coaster. For a fraction of a second, the mottled purple and yellow bruise on the delicate skin of her inner wrist was exposed to the soft ambient light. It was a small thing, a fleeting imperfection in the Viridian's flawless world. She quickly tugged the sleeve down, her heart giving a painful little lurch, but the damage was done. She had seen him see it. His eyes, the color of dark, aged whiskey, had flickered down to her wrist and then back up to her face. There was no change in his expression. No pity, no curiosity, no judgment. Nothing. He simply inclined his head in a silent, "Thank you" for the wine and picked up his fork. But for the rest of his meal, Ilara felt his gaze. It wasn't leering or invasive. It was something else, something heavier. It was the look of a man who didn't just see a bruise, but understood the grammar of violence it was written in. She tried to ignore it, focusing on the rhythm of her work, orders in, plates out, smiles on. But the quiet intensity from table 12 followed her. It was a strange, unsettling feeling. In a life where she strived to be unseen, she had been noticed by the one man everyone else tried to ignore. When he finally left, placing a crisp $100 bill on the table for a $60 meal, she felt a shiver of something that wasn't quite fear, but its close cousin. As she cleared his table, she found his gaze had left an imprint on her, a silent question hanging in the air of the empty alcove. And for the first time, she felt a sliver of terror, not of the man at table 12, but of the answer he might already know. The front door of her small apartment clicked shut behind her with a sound of finality, the sound of a cage being locked. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of cheap beer and Mark's simmering resentment. He was sprawled on the threadbare sofa, the blue light of the television flickering across his face. He didn't look up. "You're late," he grumbled, his voice a low growl. "The last table stayed past closing," Ilara said, her voice soft, placating. She began the nightly ritual of de-armoring, kicking off her painful shoes, unpinning her hair, peeling off the apron that smelled of other people's happiness. "Sure. Or you were flirting for bigger tips again." He finally turned to look at her, his eyes narrowed. Mark had been handsome once, with a lazy charm that had swept her off her feet. Now that charm had curdled into a possessive, ugly thing. Unemployment had eaten away at his pride, leaving only a raw, angry nerve. "Don't be ridiculous, Mark. I was working." He stood up, and the room seemed to shrink. He was bigger than her, a fact he used as a constant, unspoken threat. He stalked over to where she stood by the small kitchenette and snatched the wad of cash from her hand. He counted it slowly, deliberately. 140. Not bad. That quiet guy leave you another big one? Ilara stiffened. "I don't know what you're talking about." Don't lie to me, he sneered, stepping closer. Connie from the kitchen told me. Some rich creep at table 12 always leaves you 100. What are you doing for him, Ilara? Giving him a little extra service with his risotto? His words were like acid. She flinched, turning her head away. He's just a customer. He's quiet, he never says anything. Oh, he doesn't have to say anything, does he? Mark's hand shot out and grabbed her chin, forcing her to look at him. His fingers dug into her jaw. Men like that, they just look. And girls like you just comply. Don't you? Stop it, Mark. You're hurting me. His grip tightened for a moment before he shoved her away. Make me dinner, I'm starving. She stumbled back, catching her breath, the ghost of his fingerprints already blooming on her skin. She said nothing, just turned to the refrigerator and pulled out what little there was. The silence in the apartment was loud, filled with the things they never said and the violence that was always just a breath away. As she chopped onions, tears streaming down her face, she thought of the man at table 12. She thought of his silent, assessing gaze. He saw the bruise on her wrist. What would he see now? What would he see next week? The fear was no longer a distant cousin. It was in the room with her, sitting on the sofa, watching television and waiting for his dinner. The following Tuesday, the new bruise was on her cheekbone, a faint plum-colored shadow that no amount of concealer could fully hide. She kept her hair down, trying to let it fall in a way that might obscure it. Her hands trembled all day. Every time she approached a table, she felt a hot flush of shame, certain that everyone was staring, everyone was judging, everyone knew her ugly little secret. When Alessandro Moretti arrived at 8 o'clock, her stomach twisted into a knot of pure dread. She wanted to ask another waitress, Maria, to take his table, but she couldn't. It was her section. To refuse would draw attention, and attention was the last thing she needed. Taking a deep breath, she walked over to table 12. "Good evening, Mr. Moretti. Your usual?" she asked, her voice a little too bright, her eyes fixed on the knot of his tie. He didn't answer immediately. The silence stretched, pulling taut. She could feel his eyes on her face, a slow, methodical scan. She forced herself to meet his gaze. His expression was unchanged, a mask of calm neutrality. But his eyes were different tonight. They were harder, colder, like chips of obsidian. He had seen it. Of course, he had seen it. "Yes, Ilara," he said, his voice a low, smooth baritone. It was the first time he had ever used her name. The sound of it from his lips was both intimate and alarming. The usual. Throughout his meal, the silence was heavier than ever before. He ate with the same unhurried precision, but his stillness felt coiled, like a predator waiting. Ilara felt as though she were moving under a spotlight. Every trip she made to his table was an exercise in terror. She was so flustered that when she poured his second glass of wine, her trembling hand caused a single, ruby-red drop to splash onto the pristine white tablecloth. "I'm so sorry," she gasped, fumbling for a napkin. "Leave it," he commanded. The words were not harsh, but they stopped her cold. He looked from the red stain on the cloth to the ugly mark on her cheek. "Some things," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "cannot be covered up." His meaning was terrifyingly clear. He wasn't just a customer anymore, he was a witness. When he left that night, the $100 bill was there as always, but this time, tucked beneath it, were two more. $300. It wasn't a tip. It felt like something else entirely. A down payment. A message. A warning. She scooped up the money with a shaking hand, her mind racing. Who was this man? And what did he want from her? The money felt heavy in her pocket, like a stone that was pulling her down into waters far deeper and more dangerous than she could ever imagine. The bell above the Viridian's heavy oak door chimed, a cheerful, incongruous sound that cut through the low hum of dinner service. Ilara looked up from polishing wine glasses, and her blood ran cold. It was Mark. He was standing in the entrance, swaying slightly, a belligerent smirk on his face. He was drunk. Not just a few beers drunk, but sloppy, aggressive drunk. Her carefully constructed world, the fragile barrier between her life at work and her life at home, was about to be shattered. The maitre d', a perpetually flustered man named Julian, hurried over. "Sir, do you have a reservation?" "Reservation?" Mark laughed, a loud, ugly sound that turned heads. I don't need a reservation. I'm here to see my girl. His eyes scanned the room and locked onto Elara. There she is, my hard-working little bee. Panic seized her. She could feel the stares of her colleagues, the curious glances of the diners, and from the corner of her eye, she could see the still, watchful silhouette at table 12. He had just been served his risotto. He hadn't looked up, but she knew he was listening. "Mark, what are you doing here?" she hissed, rushing over to him, trying to steer him back towards the door. "You can't be here. This is my job." "This is where you hide from me, you mean?" he slurred, grabbing her arm. His grip was like a vice. "This is where you smile for all these rich pigs, hoping one of them will take you away from me." "Please, Mark, let's go," she begged, her voice trembling. She tugged at her arm, but he only tightened his grip, digging his fingers into the tender flesh of her bicep. "Not until you introduce me," he said loudly, a cruel glint in his eye. He was enjoying this, enjoying her humiliation. "Let's meet your special friend, the one at table 12. He started to drag her across the dining room. Julian fluttered helplessly. The diners fell silent, forks paused halfway to their mouths. It was a slow-motion nightmare. Every step was an agony of shame. They were approaching the alcove, and Elara could see Alessandro Moretti clearly now. He had placed his fork and knife neatly on his plate. He was watching them approach, his face completely devoid of expression. It was the most terrifying thing she had ever seen. "This him?" Mark sneered, shoving Elara forward. She stumbled, catching herself on the edge of the table. "This the guy who pays for your attention?" Alessandro didn't look at Mark. His dark eyes were fixed on Elara, on the terror in her face, on the white-knuckled grip Mark had on her arm. He then let his gaze travel down to where Mark's fingers were bruising her, and a subtle shift occurred in the air around him. The temperature seemed to drop. "You are creating a disturbance," Alessandro said. His voice was unnervingly calm, a low rumble that cut through the tension. "You should leave," Mark laughed again. "Or what? You gonna bore me to death with your fancy food?" He gave Elara's arm a vicious shake. "She's with me. I do what I want. Let go of her." Each word was a block of ice, delivered with a quiet finality that promised consequences. For a moment, Mark seemed to hesitate, perhaps sensing he had crossed a line into a territory he didn't understand. But the alcohol and his own pathetic pride won out. He puffed out his chest. "Make me." It happened faster than anyone could process. Alessandro Moretti moved with a fluid, lethal economy of motion. He wasn't rising from his chair, he was uncoiling. One moment he was seated, the next he was standing, his hand clamping down on Mark's wrist. There was a sickening crack of bone, and Mark screamed, his grip on Elara instantly releasing. Elara scrambled back, her heart hammering against her ribs. Mark, clutching his broken wrist, his face a mask of shock and pain, spat, "You son of a bitch, I'll kill you." He swung his good arm in a wild, clumsy punch. Alessandro sidestepped the blow with contemptuous ease. He didn't retaliate with a punch. He did something far more dramatic, far more absolute. As Mark stumbled forward from his own momentum, Alessandro pivoted and drove the sole of his polished leather shoe into Mark's chest. It wasn't a frantic kick. It was a powerful, calculated thrust, a piston of pure force. The impact lifted Mark off his feet. He flew backward, a human projectile aimed directly at the large bay window behind him. The sound was explosive, a deafening roar of shattering glass that ripped through the restaurant's hushed atmosphere. For a heartbeat, there was absolute silence, broken only by the tinkle of glass falling onto the wet pavement outside. Mark lay in a heap on the sidewalk, a crumpled mess of limbs and broken glass, moaning in agony. The entire dining room was frozen in stunned disbelief. Elara stared at the jagged, gaping hole in the window, at the night air rushing in, cold and sharp. Then she looked at Alessandro. He stood perfectly still in the center of the alcove, his suit not even rumpled. He calmly adjusted his cufflink, his gaze sweeping over the shocked faces of the patrons before settling on her. There was no triumph in his eyes, no anger. There was only a cold, hard certainty. He had just kicked a man through a plate-glass window in one of Chicago's most exclusive restaurants, and he looked as if he had just sent back a corked bottle of wine. Two men, previously unnoticed at a table near the bar, were suddenly on their feet and moving towards him. They were dressed as impeccably as he was, their faces grim and professional. "Boss," one of them said, his voice low and urgent. Alessandro ignored him. He looked at Ilara, who was pressed against the wall, shaking uncontrollably. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice gentle now, a stark contrast to the violence he had just unleashed. She could only nod, unable to find her voice. He gave a curt nod to his men. "Luca, Marco, handle this, pay for everything. The window, the diner's meals, Mr. Julian's therapy, and get him." He gestured dismissively towards the street. "Out of my sight. Make sure he understands the concept of permanence." The men moved with quiet efficiency. One went to deal with a stammering Julian, pulling out a thick roll of cash. The other walked calmly through the shattered window frame and hauled the whimpering Mark to his feet, dragging him into a black sedan that had materialized at the curb. Alessandro Moretti turned back to Ilara, his attention absolute. The chaos, the broken glass, the terrified whispers of the other patrons. It all faded away. There was only him, standing in the wreckage he had created for her. "Come with me," he said. It wasn't a request, it was a statement of fact. "Your life as you know it is over. So is mine." The ride was silent. Ilara sat in the back of the black sedan, the scent of expensive leather and Alessandro's subtle, clean cologne filling the small space. The city lights blurred into streaks of gold and red as the car moved with impossible smoothness through the streets. She didn't know where they were going. She hadn't asked. The power to ask questions, to make choices, seemed to have been stripped from her the moment that window shattered. She kept replaying the scene in her mind. The crack of bone, the explosion of glass, the terrifying calm on Alessandro's face. He sat beside her, not touching her, but his presence was a physical weight. He stared out the window, his profile etched against the passing city. He seemed completely at ease, a man in his natural element, while her own world had just been detonated. They didn't go to a lavish mansion or a penthouse suite, as she might have imagined. The car pulled into a discreet underground garage beneath a modern, anonymous-looking apartment building in a quiet, wealthy neighborhood. One of his men, Luca, led them to a private elevator that opened directly into a spacious, minimalist apartment. It was clean, beautifully furnished, but impersonal. It felt like a safe house, not a home. "There's a full wardrobe in the bedroom closet," Alessandro said, his voice breaking the long silence. "Clothes, shoes, everything you need. The bathroom is stocked. There's food in the kitchen." He gestured vaguely around the living room. "You will be safe here. No one will find you." Ilara finally found her voice, though it was small and shaky. "Who are you?" He turned to face her fully, his dark eyes holding hers. There was no point in pretense now. "My name is Alessandro Moretti. I am the head of the Moretti family." The name meant nothing to her, but the title, head of the family, sent a fresh wave of fear through her. This wasn't just a rich man with a temper. This was something else entirely. Mafia. The word screamed in her mind, a cliché from movies that had suddenly become terrifyingly real. "Why?" she whispered. "Why did you do that?" A flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes. "He put his hands on you. In my presence. That is an insult I do not tolerate." He paused, his gaze intense. "But it was more than that. I have been watching you for weeks, Ilara. I saw the first bruise. And the next. I saw the fear you tried so hard to hide. Tonight was merely the inevitable conclusion." She wrapped her arms around herself, a cold dread seeping into her bones. He had been watching her. It wasn't just a shared silence over dinner, it was scrutiny. Surveillance. "You've put me in more danger," she said, the words tumbling out. "Mark. He'll come after me. He'll be furious." Alessandro gave a short, mirthless laugh. "Mark will not be coming after you. Mark will not be doing much of anything ever again. That is a problem that has been solved." The finality in his tone was absolute. He spoke of a man's life as if it were a minor inconvenience he had tidied away. "The police," she started. "The police were never called," he interrupted smoothly. "And if they were, they would have found a simple accident. A drunken patron who tripped and fell through a window that was, regrettably, not up to safety codes." The Viridian has already been compensated so generously for their faulty window that they have forgotten the incident ever occurred. He had erased it. With money and power, he had erased a moment of brutal public violence as if it had never happened. But he hadn't erased the consequences. He walked over to a wet bar in the corner and poured 2 glasses of amber liquid. He handed one to her. It was whiskey. She took it, her fingers numb. "You need to understand something," he said, his voice dropping to a more serious, somber tone. "What I did tonight was not just about him. It was a breach of protocol, a public display. In my world, such actions are seen as a loss of control, a weakness." He took a slow sip of his whiskey. "And weakness is an invitation for attack." He looked at her over the rim of his glass. That man, Mark, was not important. But he was a street-level dealer who paid tribute to another family, the Falcone family. He said the name as if it left a bad taste in his mouth. "By assaulting him so publicly, I have thrown a gauntlet at their feet. I have disrespected them in a way that cannot be ignored. They will have to respond." The pieces clicked into place in her mind, forming a horrifying picture. This wasn't just about a bar fight. It was about territory, respect, and the brutal codes of a world she knew nothing about. "What you saw tonight," he continued, "was me signing my own death warrant, and by extension yours." The glass nearly slipped from her hand. "Mine? I didn't do anything." "You were the reason," he stated simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "To them, you are the woman for whom Alessandro Moretti lost his composure. You are the symbol of his weakness. To get to me, or to simply send a message, they will try to get to you. Which is why you are here, and why you can never go back to your old life." He laid out her options with the cold precision of a surgeon. "Choice 1. I give you a new identity, a new name, a new social security number, a new life. I will put enough money in an account for you to go anywhere in the world you want and never have to work again. You walk out that door, you get in a car, and you disappear. I will never see you again. You will be free." He paused, letting the weight of that offer sink in. Freedom. A life without Mark, without the ache in her feet, without the constant fear. It was everything she had ever dreamed of. "Choice 2, he said, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. You stay here, with me, under my protection. Your life will not be your own, it will be dangerous. You will see things that will haunt you, but you will be safe. I swear on my father's grave, no one will ever harm you again." He placed his empty glass on the bar. "The choice is yours, Elara, a life of comfortable exile or a life of dangerous sanctuary. But you must choose now, because as of tonight, the war has already begun." She stared at him, this calm, violent, and strangely protective man who had both saved her and condemned her in the same breath. He had offered her an escape, a clean slate. It was the sensible choice, the sane choice. But as she looked into his steady, unwavering eyes, she realized something terrifying. The world he described, a world of rules and consequences, felt more real and more honest than the one she had just left. A world where a man could beat a woman behind a locked door and no one would ever know. She was tired of being a victim. She was tired of running. Taking a deep breath, she took a sip of the whiskey. It burned a fiery path down her throat, chasing away the chill. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice stronger than she thought possible. "I'm staying." A slow, small smile touched Alessandro Moretti's lips for the first time. It did not make him look friendly, it made him look like a king who had just seen his gambit pay off. The days that followed were a surreal education in a parallel reality. The apartment, which Elara came to know as the Nest, was both her gilded cage and her fortress. Luca, the stoic, broad-shouldered man from the restaurant, became her silent guardian, driving her in a blacked-out SUV on the rare occasions she needed something the Moretti organization couldn't procure. Marco, younger and more wiry, was the tech expert, ensuring the Nest was a digital black hole, untraceable and impenetrable. Alessandro was a creature of routine and control. He would leave before dawn, a phantom in a tailored suit, and return long after dusk, carrying the weight of his unseen world with him. In the evenings, he would sometimes sit with her in the living room, the city lights twinkling below like a fallen constellation. He never pressed her, never demanded anything of her. He simply shared the space, a quiet, powerful presence. He told her about his father, the former Don, who had been a man of brutal tradition, and his mother, a woman from the old country who loved opera and had a garden of roses. He spoke of his world not with pride or regret, but with a kind of weary acceptance, as if it were a genetic trait he could not escape. Ilara, in turn, found herself slowly, hesitantly opening up. She spoke of her dreams of being a painter, a life she had abandoned years ago. She spoke of the suffocating smallness of her life with Mark, the way he had chipped away at her soul until she felt like a ghost in her own skin. Alessandro listened. He didn't offer platitudes or easy comfort. He listened with that same unnerving intensity he'd had at the restaurant, as if he were memorizing every word, every crack in her voice. One evening, about a week after the incident, his consigliere, a sharp, silver-haired man named Antonio, came to the nest. He regarded Ilara with shrewd, intelligent eyes, his face a mask of polite neutrality. But she could feel his disapproval radiating off him. They spoke in the study, their voices low and urgent, but the apartment was so quiet she could catch snippets of their conversation. "Reckless Alessandro, Silvio Falcone is an old viper. You dishonored his blood, no matter how worthless the whelp was. Kicking his nephew through the window of the Viridian? It was a performance. It makes you look emotional. Unstable. Mark was a loose end that needed tying." Alessandro's voice was calm, cold. "There are 100 ways to tie a loose end. Quiet ways. This was a declaration of war over a waitress." Antonio's voice was laced with frustration. "The capos are nervous. They see you risking the family's stability for a woman. It's the one thing your father always warned against." "My father's ways put him in the ground," Alessandro retorted, his voice like steel. "Let the capos be nervous. It will keep them sharp." Later that night, after Antonio had left, Alessandro found Ilara sketching in a notebook he had bought for her. She was drawing the view from the window, the sharp angles of the city softened by the night. "Antonio does not approve of me," she said, not looking up from her drawing. "Antonio is a man of tradition. He sees you as a liability," Alessandro confirmed, standing behind her. "Am I?" she asked, her pencil stilling. He was silent for a long moment. "The truth," he said finally, his voice low, "is more complicated than that." He walked around the sofa and sat opposite her. "Do you want to know the real reason I did what I did?" She met his gaze, her heart beating a little faster. "I knew who Mark was long before he walked into my restaurant," he said, shocking her. "I knew he was Silvio Falcone's nephew. A pathetic one, a disgrace to their name, but blood all the same. I knew he was abusing you. I had my men look into your life after the first time I saw a bruise." Ilara felt a chill run down her spine. He had investigated her. This wasn't a chance encounter. It was a calculated operation. "The Falcone family has been a cancer in this city for years," he continued, his eyes hardening. "Silvio is greedy, reckless. He's been encroaching on my territory, breaking the old agreements, dealing in narcotics behind the commissionaire's back. He's been poisoning my city. But he's slippery. To move against him directly without cause would start a war that could burn us all down. I needed a reason, a justification that the other families would accept." He leaned forward, his intensity pinning her in place. "I needed a public, undeniable insult, an act of disrespect from the Falcones so egregious that my response, no matter how violent, would be seen as justified. Mark was that insult. His abuse of you was his family's sin spilling out into the open. When he walked into my restaurant, drunk and belligerent, and laid his hands on you in front of me, he wasn't just assaulting a waitress. In the eyes of our world, he was a Falcone soldier disrespecting a Moretti asset in Moretti territory." Ilara's mind reeled. An asset, a piece on a chessboard. The entire rescue, the dramatic confrontation, it wasn't just an act of chivalry. It was a strategic gambit. "So you used me," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "You used my pain to start your war." "Yes," he said, without a trace of apology. "But that does not make my desire to protect you any less genuine. Two truths can exist at once, Ilara. I needed a catalyst for a war I knew was coming, and I could not stand by and watch what he was doing to you. I simply merged the two problems into one solution. He had played a game of 4D chess, and she had been the queen he'd sacrificed to put the king in check. The revelation was dizzying. She felt a surge of anger, of being manipulated. But underneath it, a strange, terrifying admiration began to bloom. He wasn't a reckless hothead who had lost his temper. He was a cunning, cold-blooded strategist who had turned his own perceived weakness, his concern for her, into his sharpest weapon. "That death warrant you mentioned," she said slowly, "the one you signed, you wanted it. You provoked them into signing it for you." "I did," he confirmed, "and now Silvio Falcone has no choice but to retaliate. And when he does, he will overplay his hand, and I will be waiting. The war has begun, Ilara. But it is a war I intend to win." He stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the city that was now his battlefield. Ilara watched him, her sketch forgotten. She was no longer just a protected victim. She was a piece in the game, the justification for the entire conflict. Her fear was now mixed with a heavy, profound sense of consequence. The war wasn't just happening around her, it was happening because of her. And as she looked at the formidable man silhouetted against the night sky, she knew that the only way to survive was to learn the rules of his deadly game. The Falcone retaliation did not come as a frontal assault. It was a war of 1,000 cuts, designed to bleed the Moretti organization slowly. A cargo container of electronics at the port, a Moretti-controlled asset, was accidentally dropped into the harbor. A string of restaurants that paid protection money to Alessandro suddenly had health code violations that shut them down. A trusted union boss on the Moretti payroll was arrested on a decades-old charge, conveniently brought to light by an anonymous tip. It was subtle, insidious, and effective. The atmosphere in the nest grew heavier. The long silences were now filled with a low-grade tension that hummed just beneath the surface. Alessandro's nights grew later, the lines around his eyes deeper. His meetings in the study with Antonio and his capos became more frequent, the voices more strained. Ilara would sit in the living room, sketching, but her ears were always tuned to the muffled sounds of conflict. She saw the toll it was taking. One night, Alessandro came home with a slight limp he tried to hide. Another evening, Marco had a fresh cut over his eye, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced with a grim silence. This was real. The abstract war he had spoken of now had a face, a cost written in bruises and blood. Ilara refused to be a passive observer, a porcelain doll kept safe on a high shelf. She started paying attention. She listened. When Alessandro would take calls on the encrypted speakerphone in his study, she would commit names and places to memory. A warehouse on Kermack Road, a trucking company called Tri-State Logistics, a man named Paulie Gallo who ran the numbers racket in the South Side. She began to see a different side of Alessandro's world. It wasn't just violence, it was a complex web of business, loyalty, and information. Information, she realized, was the real currency. Her transformation was gradual. The timid, fearful waitress began to fade, replaced by a woman with a quiet, watchful intensity that mirrored Alessandro's own. The fear was still there, but it had been honed into a sharp edge of awareness. She learned the rhythms of the building's security, the faces of Alessandro's core crew, the difference in engine sounds between a civilian car and one of his armored sedans. She was no longer a prisoner. She was becoming part of the fortress. One afternoon, Alessandro was in the study with Luca, looking over a map of the city dotted with red and blue pins. The red pins, marking Falcone's recent attacks, were growing in number. "Silvio's getting bolder," Luca said, his voice a low growl. "This hit on the Tri-State Depot. That's deep in our territory. He's testing our response time." "He's trying to make us spread our forces thin," Alessandro mused, staring at the map. "He hits us in the west, we move men there. Then he hits us in the south. He's looking for the weak point." Ilara, who had brought them coffee, paused in the doorway. "Tri-State Logistics," she said softly. Both men turned to look at her. "Mark used to talk about it," she said, her voice steady. The memory of his voice was like poison, but she pushed through it. "He used to brag. He said his uncle Silvio owned a piece of it, but it was a ghost investment, off the books. He said it was his rainy day fund, where he washed money from his side deals." Alessandro and Luca exchanged a look. "Are you certain?" Alessandro asked, his voice sharp with focus. "He was drunk when he told me," Ilara said. "He was trying to impress me, trying to make himself seem important. He described the manager, a man with a glass eye. He called him One-Eyed Jack. He said Jack was more loyal to Silvio than his own mother." Luca pulled out his phone and started typing furiously. "There's a Jack Parisi who manages the Tri-State Depot on Chermak. Rumor is he lost an eye in a bar fight years ago." A slow, dangerous smile spread across Alessandro's face. It was the smile of a predator that had just caught the scent of its prey. "Silvio didn't hit our depot," he said, a note of triumph in his voice. "He hit his own. He torched one of his own warehouses as a feint, a distraction to make us look the other way." He looked at Ilara, and for the first time, his eyes held not just protection or possession, but genuine respect. She hadn't just provided a clue, she had given him a key. She had seen the pattern they had missed because she had a different perspective. She knew the enemy's mundane, boastful secrets. "Find out everything you can about Jack Parisi's financials," Alessandro commanded Luca. "I want to know what he had for breakfast. Then find Paulie Gallo. Tell him I have a new job for him." He turned back to Ilara after Luca had left the room. The air between them crackled with a new energy. "You did well," he said. It was high praise, coming from him. "I just listened," she said. "Listening is a skill few people in my world possess," he replied. "They're too busy talking, posturing. You see the things that hide in the shadows." That night, the dynamic between them shifted. He was no longer just her protector. She was no longer just his ward. He spread the city map out on the large coffee table and began to explain the intricate dance of power, the territories, the alliances, the betrayals. He pointed out the blue pins, his assets, and the red pins, the Falcones. He spoke of supply chains and revenue streams as if they were arteries and veins of a living creature. She absorbed it all, asking sharp, intuitive questions that surprised him. She was seeing the war not as a series of violent acts, but as a complex, strategic puzzle. Her mind, once consumed with surviving Mark's moods, was now engaged in a far deadlier game. He saw the intelligence in her eyes, the resilience he had only glimpsed at the restaurant. She wasn't a liability, she was an asset of a kind he had never had before. An outsider with an insider's view. She had been forged in the fire of abuse, and it had made her observant, empathetic, and able to read the subtle currents of human behavior in a way his hardened soldiers never could. As he watched her trace a potential Falcone supply route on the map with her finger, a thought struck him with the force of a physical blow. He had started this war to protect her and to consolidate his own power. But now, with her by his side, he felt for the first time that he was not just going to win. He was going to be invincible. The trap was set with the precision of a master watchmaker. Armed with the knowledge Ilara had provided, Alessandro didn't launch a bloody counterattack. He opted for something far more elegant and devastating. His man, Paulie Gallo, a slick operator with connections everywhere, paid a visit to One-Eyed Jack Parisi. It wasn't a visit of intimidation, it was one of temptation. Paulie laid out a deal, supposedly on behalf of a new player in town, offering to buy out Tri-State Logistics' off-book shipping manifests for an exorbitant sum. He made it clear he knew Jack was skimming from Silvio Falcone's money laundering operation. The choice was simple: sell the information and disappear a rich man, or stay and eventually face Silvio's wrath when the skimming was discovered. Jack, a greedy man at heart, chose the money. The manifests he sold were a treasure trove. They detailed the Falcones' entire narcotics distribution network, hidden within legitimate cargo shipments. It listed routes, contacts, and, most importantly, payment trails that led directly to offshore accounts held by Silvio Falcone himself. It was the kind of hard evidence the other families on the Commissione, who officially forbade drug trafficking, would see as an unforgivable transgression. But Alessandro didn't take the evidence to the Commissione. Not yet. That would be playing his hand too early. Instead, he used it to set the final piece of his trap. He had Luca anonymously tip off a specific, notoriously ambitious federal agent about one, and only one, of the Falcone drug shipments. He chose a mid-level one, large enough to be significant, but not so large as to cripple the entire operation. The bust went down exactly as planned. Federal agents swarmed a warehouse in the Calumet district, seizing millions of dollars in narcotics and arresting a dozen of Silvio Falcone's men. The news sent a shockwave through the city's underworld. Silvio was exposed, humiliated, and most importantly, weakened. His soldiers were off the street, and his revenue stream had taken a major hit. Now he was vulnerable. Now it was time for the checkmate. Alessandro requested a sit-down, not just with Silvio, but with the heads of the other 4 major families, the Commissione. The meeting was set on neutral ground. The wine cellar of an old, decommissioned church on the north side, a place where business had been conducted for generations. The night of the meeting, a tense silence filled the nest. Ilara helped Alessandro with his tie, her fingers surprisingly steady. She was no longer the trembling waitress from the Viridian. She stood tall, her eyes clear and focused. She wore a simple, elegant black dress, her hair pulled back. She looked not like a victim, but like a queen. "You don't have to come," he said, his voice low as he watched her in the mirror. "You started this because of me," she replied, meeting his gaze in the reflection. "I'm going to be there when you finish it." His eyes softened. He turned and placed his hands on her shoulders. "It will be dangerous." "My life has been dangerous since the day I met you," she said, with a small, wry smile. "I'm used to it." He nodded, a look of profound respect on his face. He knew she was right. She was no longer a civilian caught in the crossfire. She was part of the strategy, the secret weapon he held in reserve. The wine cellar was cold and damp, smelling of old earth and aging wood. The heads of the 5 families sat around a massive oak table, their faces like stone masks in the dim light. Silvio Falcone was at the far end, his face a thunderous shade of purple, his eyes burning with hatred for Alessandro. Alessandro began, his voice calm and measured. He didn't shout or make accusations. He laid out the timeline of events, starting with the constant low-level provocations from the Falcone family. He spoke of the encroachment on his territory, the broken agreements. And then, Alessandro said, his voice dropping, came the ultimate insult. "One of his blood, his nephew, brings his filth and his violence into my place of business. He puts his hands on a woman under my roof. An act of profound disrespect." Silvio slammed his fist on the table. "Your roof. She was a waitress. You started a war, boy, over a nobody. You broke the code with your public display." "Did I?" Alessandro asked softly. He gestured to Luca, who placed a single slim folder in the center of the table. "Or did you?" One of the other bosses, a calculating man named Don Ricci, opened the folder. Inside were copies of the Tri-State Logistics manifests, and bank statements from offshore accounts, and a grainy surveillance photo of Silvio Falcone meeting with the very federal agent who had led the drug bust. A collective gasp went through the room. The evidence was undeniable. Silvio wasn't just dealing drugs, a cardinal sin. He was a rat. He had been feeding information to the feds, sacrificing his own men and operations to take down his rivals, namely Alessandro. The warehouse bust wasn't Alessandro's tip. It had been Silvio's own controlled burn, a desperate attempt to frame Alessandro that had now backfired spectacularly. "You brought the feds into our business," Don Ricci said, his voice filled with cold fury as he stared at Silvio. "You have broken the most sacred rule." Silvio Falcone's face went pale. He was trapped, exposed. His blustering anger evaporated, replaced by the naked fear of a man who knows he is already dead. Alessandro Moretti stood up. He hadn't raised his voice once. He had won not with bullets, but with information, strategy, and the quiet word of a woman who had once been invisible. "The Falcone problem," Alessandro announced to the room, "will be dealt with internally. By me. Their territory, their assets. They will be absorbed by the Moretti family as compensation for this treachery. The war is over." No one argued. The verdict had been delivered. Alessandro had not only survived his death warrant, he had turned it into a mandate for expansion. He had transformed a perceived weakness into an act of legendary cunning. He turned and walked towards the cellar door, where Ilara was waiting in the shadows. He held out his hand to her. She took it, her hand fitting perfectly in his. As they walked out of the cold, dark cellar and into the cool night air, they left the old world of brutal, predictable violence behind them. They had won, and they had done it their way. The city was his, and he was hers. Weeks later, they stood on the balcony of a different apartment. This one was a penthouse, high above the city, with a view that stretched all the way to the dark, placid waters of Lake Michigan. It was a home, not a safe house, filled with art supplies for her and rare books for him. The war was a memory, a story whispered in the underworld about the time Alessandro Moretti outsmarted the Viper, Silvio Falcone, who had simply disappeared. The Moretti family was more powerful than ever, its foundations secured by a new kind of leader. A leader who valued intelligence over brute force, strategy over impulsive rage. Alessandro came to stand behind Ilara, wrapping his arms around her waist as she looked out at the glittering expanse of the city. It was a clear, peaceful night. "I can still give you that new life," he said quietly into her hair. His voice held no agenda, no manipulation. It was a genuine offer, a promise he intended to keep if she chose it. A new name. A quiet town in Italy, perhaps. A gallery for your paintings. You would be safe. You would be free. Ilara leaned back against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. She thought of the woman she used to be, the one who dreamed of escape. That woman would have taken the offer in a heartbeat. But she wasn't that woman anymore. She had walked through fire and emerged not scorched, but forged. "What would you do?" she asked. "I would run this city," he answered honestly, "and I would miss you every single day." She turned in his arms to face him, her hazel eyes clear and full of a strength she never knew she possessed. She reached up and touched the sharp line of his jaw. "You told me once that two truths can exist at once," she said. "Here is another one. This world is dangerous and violent, and I am finally free." She was not free from him, but free within his world. Free from fear, free from weakness, free from the invisibility that had once been her only shield. Here, in the heart of the storm, she was seen, she was valued, she was a partner. "My place is here," she said, her voice unwavering. "With you." A genuine, unguarded smile touched Alessandro's lips. It transformed his face, chasing away the shadows. He leaned down and kissed her, a kiss that was not about passion or possession, but about a profound and unbreakable partnership. They were two damaged souls who had found their unlikely sanctuary in each other. Their future would be paved with risk and shadowed by the world they commanded, but it would be a future they faced together. Looking out at the vast, sleeping city below, they were not just a Mafia boss and the woman he saved. They were a king and queen, standing on the balcony of their hard-won kingdom.